Hi everyone. Today's episode is sure to blow your socks off. I have 3 stories that reveal fascinating information that will make you wonder if the things you know are really true. You might even reconsider everything you've ever learned. But first, please snuggle up and pull your socks up tight, then get to know that subscribe button. Thanks. Now let's get into the stories. Most people don't think of the hills when they think of Texas. I don't know why that is. When I think of Texas, the first thing I think of is the hills. Maybe that's because I grew up there. Until I was about 20 years old, the hills were all I knew. My family tended a goat ranch for a few generations. We would still be there, I think, if it wasn't for what happened to me. If it wasn't for what I saw. It was my last summer there. I was 20. And for the first time in my life, my father wasn't working alongside me. So his responsibilities fell to me. Soon I was feeding, cleaning, and herding all of the livestock myself. But I forgot something very important. My father had rules for the ranch. Goats had to be in certain places at certain times, and those rules were even more strict during the summer. Whenever I asked why, he explained it away as lessons he had inherited from his grandfather. I guess those rules didn't stick with me so good. The summer got hot, and I got tired. I got a little lax with my duties. Before I knew it, some of the goats had split from the ranch. They had run loose into the hills looking for who knows what. It's hard to read a goat's mind. So it came down to me, of course, to chase them. I tracked most of them down pretty quickly, too, but one was a little more hard-headed than the rest. I didn't get my sights on him until the sun was going down. I didn't know it at the time, but I was already too late. Something got to the goat before me. It was just a blur at first. It was a gray streak against the rolling browns and yellows of the terrain. The blur passed by me, and before I knew what was happening, my goat was gone. I didn't know what I was seeing, so I kept approaching the area where I saw that mysterious shape collide with my animal. There were tracks in the dirt. There were signs of a struggle, but not a lot, so it was obvious that the struggle ended quickly. And then there were drag marks leading away from the site. How could it have snatched the goat off of its feet and dragged it away without me seeing? Without even slowing down? It didn't make any sense. In my mind, the thought of something moving that fast and colliding with an animal, I would have expected a bit of carnage, but there wasn't a drop of blood on the ground. I continued looking around, only to hear this strange clicking in the distance. Something was chattering its teeth. I looked in that direction, but with the light fading, I couldn't make it out. It was too far away, but I could tell that whatever it was watching me, warning me somehow. Maybe it was telling me that the game was about to begin. I knew I needed to get back. I needed to get out of those hills before I disappeared too. Whatever I was dealing with, I was confident that it could carry me away as cleanly as it had my goat. I'd come up on an ATV, but I had left it a while back so I wouldn't scare the goat as I closed in. But it was still nearby. I just had to get to it. Unfortunately for me, the thing knew exactly where I was headed. So just when I turned to run, the blur came back, and it streaked out in front of me and skidded to a sudden halt. It moved faster than any animal I had ever seen. And then what was glaring at me was something almost indescribable. It was gray-skinned and almost scaly, but in the shape of a large dog. Its tail looked barbed, and its eyes were wide and bulging, almost like a toad's. I didn't want to find out if it could jump like one, too. Fortunately for me, one of the rules of the ranch that I did follow was to remain armed at all times. I had never seen a creature like the one in front of me, but I had seen my share of wily predators. I held my breath and fired a bullet into the air, hoping it would be enough to scare the monster away. I got lucky. It was. I saw those bulging eyes go wide, staring at the gun as if it recognized the weapon. And then it dashed away, maybe to escape, maybe to regroup. I didn't stick around to find out. I sprinted for my own getaway. I started that ATV and tore out of there. I was embarrassed at first, but eventually I did tell my father. How else would I explain that we had lost one of our own? He seemed relieved. I guess he was more thankful that I had gotten away than he was upset at my laziness. I honestly expected him to chew me out. Instead, he agreed when I suggested that it might be time for me to move on from the ranch. Truth was, I didn't want to go back out there. If he had known about that creature all this time and still wanted to tend our animals, well, that was his decision. But it wasn't mine. So I headed off to the city for work. But now, recently, my father has passed away. All I can think about are those hills. Part of them are mine too, I suppose. The land we worked on, the animals we tended to, and the house we grew up in. They all fall to me now. I don't really want to say goodbye to that place, at least not permanently. But how do I go back there and feel safe after seeing what I did? Is it just a matter of obeying the old rules that he taught me? Or would it be wiser for me to stay far away from that home? Stay away. Stay in the city. When I was about 16, I went to a party with a few friends. I didn't really care for high school parties, but my friends ended up dragging me along, despite knowing I didn't want to go. It was a typical high school party. My friends went about mingling and flirting with other partygoers while I found a comfy spot on the living room couch. I was bored out of my mind, quite honestly, and about to ditch my friends when a few girls came into the living room, giggling with a game board. They were conversing amongst themselves, saying they had to try this game. They didn't seem to notice me, and I didn't care at all. I was just sort of enjoying watching and sitting in the background. Eventually, they got started, and I was standing to leave when one of them called me over, saying, "Hey, we need a fourth person. Come play with us." I reluctantly figured that whatever it was would be better than moping around, so I agreed. I sat down by them, and they opened the game board. Only, it wasn't a game. I recognized the board, but I had never used one myself. The word Ouija was at the top of the board, and the letters of the alphabet were scattered across. I was intrigued right away as they explained how it worked. If only I could have forecasted the events that would transpire soon. One girl instructed each of us to place our hands on a wooden piece that had a clear lens at the top, and then another girl asked loudly if there were any spirits that would like to communicate with us. Instantly, the wooden piece slid up to yes. I hadn't moved it, but I was totally convinced that one of them had. I chuckled to myself, thinking, okay, they're just trying to mess with me. Then it was my turn to ask a question, but I wasn't sure what to ask. And then I thought, let me just ask the name of who we were conversing with. I asked, and the wooden piece instantly shifted around the board, and it stopped momentarily on letters, eventually spelling out the name Benjamin. Immediately, one of the girls pulled away and blurted out, "No, no way. Who made that move?" We all looked around, denying it, and asked her what had happened. Why was she so freaked out? She was clearly shaken up, but eventually calmed down enough to tell us that that was the name of her older brother, who had passed away a few years ago. At that point, I could tell she wanted to ask more questions to see if it really was her brother. So she thought up a question that only she knew the answer to at the party. We all placed our hands back on the piece, and then she said, "How did you die?" The piece shifted around slowly and spelled out, "Car wreck." Her face practically went white when those two words were spelled out, which told me that it was correct. I was starting to think that this was not fake, and that we had, in fact, made contact with her brother. None of us were pressing on, asking any more questions, and she was clearly shaken up. I could tell she was trying her best to suppress emotions, but couldn't hold it in much longer. She started crying. I felt bad. I offered to go get tissues and some water. Having been secluded in the living room, I almost even forgot that there was a whole party going on. So I made my way through the crowd, and I found a walk-in pantry. I found tissues on a top shelf, and as I reached up for them, the door closed behind me, and the lights turned off. I gasped, and I was fumbling for the light switch frantically. I switched it back on and sighed. resting my head forwards on the wall. I then turned back around, and right there, I was met face to face with a boy about 18 years old wearing a football jersey. I jumped backwards. "You scared me," I yelled. He apologized for the prank. He said he was already in there when I walked in, and he's the one who had turned the lights off. He then asked if I came to these parties often because he had never seen me before. I told him I was dragged into coming, but I never had a desire to be a partygoer. He seemed nice and he sort of wanted to chat longer, but I also decided that I needed to get back to comfort the girl. Before I turned to walk away, he said, "Tell Mitchie I'm okay." I cocked my head to the side, thinking he must have mistaken me for somebody else. And then I returned to the group of girls and gave them water and tissues. I asked the girl a few questions, like how old her brother was and what he looked like. She said he was really into sports and especially loved football. She went on about their childhood growing up and all the memories they had had together. In the moment, she seemed to really be connecting with me. And so she pulled out her phone and showed me a couple pictures of them, one in particular before a football game. I instantly froze. Her brother was the guy I ran into in the pantry. I stood up, shaking and confused. "What kind of sick prank is this?" I yelled. The other girls looked at me puzzled. I was mad. But then, I don't know what came over me. It was like I lost control of my body. I could feel it happening to me, and then I said, "Mitchie, I'm okay now." I mean, it was my body, but I wasn't in my body. I was mouthing the words, but it wasn't my voice. A few seconds later, I snapped out of it, and I blurted out that I had just seen her brother in the pantry. We all then looked at each other. We knew exactly what had happened, but none of us said anything about it out loud. This happened about 10 years ago, and that group of girls and I are still very close friends to this day. Granted, we haven't touched a Ouija board since, but I believe that my friend got some closure and was able to move on in a way that she hadn't been able to before. Whether it was all real or not, at least she can now feel better. This second story involves a police officer who saw something that no one should ever have to see. It happened in the town of St. Augustine, Florida in 1972. One night I was working the midnight shift. I was dispatched to a call of a possible prowler at an old abandoned house near the beach. The dispatcher said that supposedly no one had lived in the house for years and that it was thought by locals to be haunted. Well, I arrived at the location, looked around for a while, but found no sign of anyone. Thinking I might have been called to the area for nothing, I decided to cruise around town for a while, just checking it out, before returning to the station. As I drove by what we called the sand dunes, something caught my eye in the middle of the road ahead. It looked like a pile of rags or clothes in the middle of the road, so I slowed down as I approached it so that I could avoid hitting it. Then suddenly, this thing stood up on two legs, and it stood there looking at me with glowing red eyes. It was about 5 feet 9 inches tall and very thin, with long arms that hung way past its knees. It stood there and watched me as I drove past at about 35 miles an hour. And when I reached the next intersection, I turned around and headed back towards it just to see what was going on. But as I approached the area again, it was gone. But there was no place for it to go, to hide. This thing seemed to literally disappear into thin air. I drove up and down the streets in that area for a while looking for it, but I never found any further traces. And then the following day, another officer and I returned to the abandoned house on the beach where the original call had come from. We walked around the house looking for any signs of a prowler or anything unusual when we heard something approaching in the sand behind us. We both turned around at exactly the same time to see this thing standing there watching us, the thing with glowing red eyes. It was about 20 feet away. It stood there watching us for about 30 seconds before suddenly taking 2 giant steps towards us before stopping. And then it took another 2 steps, and then it stopped again. And it continued this slow, deliberate movement towards us for another 30 seconds before suddenly taking off in this amazing burst of speed. I mean, it literally disappeared into thin air as it ran off into the distance. We both stood there in total amazement at what we had just seen. There was no doubt in my mind that it was exactly the same creature I had seen the night before. After talking to several people who lived in the area, I learned that this house on the beach where we had the encounter was known by many to be haunted, and no one ever wanted to enter the house or check out any of the strange noises purported to come from inside. So, with nothing to go on but our word of mouth, the case was dropped. And then several years later, a local TV station did a special on this house and its supposed haunting. They brought in an expert who used electronic equipment to try and pick up any unusual activity or spirits inside the house. He captured some very strange sounds on his equipment, but when he played them back, skeptics claimed that they were just birds or other natural ocean noises picked up by the equipment. I've always wondered if what we saw that night was a ghost or something else. Whatever it was definitely not of this world. It had glowing red eyes and could basically disappear into thin air. I mean, it moved so slowly towards us that we did have plenty of time to observe it, and we know what we saw. The only thing I can think of is that maybe it was some type of a primate or hominid that lived in Florida thousands of years ago before modern man arrived here. But whatever it was, I know for sure that it wasn't human. I often wonder if there are more like it out there. Have any of you seen anything similar?